Good evening and welcome. This is Pain to Power Leading with Love, and I am your host, Maria Cosme, also known as Brown Girl Interrupting. And on our show, we are always talking about the journey of finding our power within our pain and all the different ways that we can lead others to find their healing as well. So before I introduce my very exciting guest in just a few moments, I want to just take a moment. I'm very excited today, y'all. It is my birthday eve, which means tomorrow I turn 46, which is bittersweet, but also a beautiful thing. And as I'm thinking about that, and this weekend, as I've been celebrating with many people who love me and have surrounded me with that love, I've been around a lot of different women. And I've learned something in this process of engaging with all these different women and just our moments together is as I'm looking at some people and hearing their stories of this idea of who I can project to see myself as in the future, what that life would look like. And in some conversations, I'm talking to others who are looking at me and can see who they want to be as they project and think about the future. And I've just been thinking about this a lot because that's what life is. We are constantly surrounded by these different images and individuals who can show us the potential and the opportunity of what is in front of us, and also the growth and the healing that we have done from what is behind us. And so for me, it might be meeting someone who has that exact relationship that I've been looking for and living by the water in peace the way that I was looking for. But for others, they're looking at me and thinking they want to be at that point of that healing journey. And so we are shepherding each other into our healing and recognizing how much more there is. And I just think about that. And I know I'm talking about women, but it's really all of us. Think about, and as you go through your day, how are you seeing those images through others of who you want to continue to grow to be? And how are you recognizing those images of others and recognizing the journey that you have come through to become where you are? So it is a beautiful thing when we heal in community, when we all learn from each other and we shepherd each other into that process. And so I am about to introduce to you thank you so much, Geologic and friends. I am going to introduce to you my guest today, Ron Rapatalo, who is himself a talent shepherd. He is a motivational speaker, the author of the book Leverage the people who love and care about you personally and professionally, and the host of the podcast Ronderings. So we are shifting gears and flipping the switch a little bit here, because instead of interviewing me, I am interviewing you to learn a little bit more about you. So welcome, Ron.
Maria, it's always good to be on the other side of the desk. So I love being a guest.
It really is. It's a nice opportunity, and I'm so glad you're with me because you get the opportunity to share your story, and it is quite an interesting story that you have. So first off, I'd love to hear a little bit just about your background, who you are, your growing up, and then let's talk a little bit more about your journey that you've had to get to where you are.
Yeah, it's funny because I start off my own podcast Ronderings with what people's story is. So I have to practice sharing my story. So I'm a child of Philippine immigrants, youngest of seven, the only one born in America. My dad came in 1970 from the Philippines, looking for a better way of life for a family of six because I wasn't born yet. My mom and the first six were petitioned in April of 72 to come months before martial law got instituted by Marcos. So something that I've learned in history is that the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 allowed I, as an Asian American, many other Asian Americans to come to this country. And so I have to give props to the Black civil rights activists that pushed for the Immigration and Naturalization Act 1965, because I don't think I'd be here without that. So that's something that I sit in terms of my social justice journey. So I was born in 75, number 7. My mom was 43 when she had me. So you can interpret that as my mom and dad were not expecting numbers.
Surprise, right?
Surprise child. Was born in East Flatbush, Kings County Hospital. East Flatbush at the time was pretty mixed. If anybody's ever watched the Lords of Flatbush, Flatbush in the 50s and 60s was predominantly Italian, white. By the time that my family settled there in the 70s, it was getting to be a lot more mixed. And fast forward, particularly Caribbean, Jamaican, black, right?
Mm.
If you've ever gone to New York City and gone to Flatbush or East Flatbush, heavy Caribbean roots. And so I grew up around that milieu. So growing up in diversity, growing up around communities of color is just something that I saw the world as being normal, right? Um,
Mm.
at age 6, because we lived in a 3-bedroom apartment and it was cramped, my parents got a home in South Ozone Park, Queens. And so the American dream, we have a home in Queens. Um, Queens, South Ozone Park, Queens at that time was a predominantly Italian Irish neighborhood. And then starting in the mid 80s, it became a predominantly uh, Guyanese, Trinidadian, mostly ethnically South Asian neighborhood. And
Mm.
so I went through a mix of a number of different neighborhoods and growing up around a lot of people, including just, growing around a lot of Filipinos. So childhood was loud. I mean, being in a family of 7, um,
Yeah.
my oldest brother is, let me get my years right, 16 years older than me.
Oh.
So, there was a lot going on in the Rapatalo family. One of the things that I point towards in my childhood growing up, my father passed away when I was 10. So it's one of those seminal moments growing up. You don't ever expect as a child that your parent will pass that young. And when it did, it just created that's I think, in talking about the title of your podcast, Mar, leveraging pain into power, that's pain that never goes away. Is just understood, right? The death
Mm.
of your parent. And I learned a lot from it. Um, but I also think there was we were all affected. If there could be a documentary about my family's life, the way that my father's death affected each of us is in of itself a story.
Mm.
Um, and particularly the story for me that I've shared with folks is when there was a big family fight the night before my father passed, I slept through the whole fight. Really crazy and weird, right? So I didn't know what happened until probably a couple days after my dad passed, and one of my siblings told me, "I think you should know this story because it gives context about what the kind of environment about how my dad had a major heart attack that night." And
Mm-hmm.
it's one of those really interesting things. I think as a young kid, I think that I was meant not to witness that. Because I think if I did, I don't know, it would have been really rough to have seen all that the way it was described to me, the big family.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
But I didn't, and so I didn't come into my father's death blaming anybody in my family because I didn't feel it. That's not to say my other siblings didn't. That's a different story altogether. That's their story, right? But um, I share that moment because it's one of the very first moments that comes to mind about you know that pain, and then over time it became something really powerful for me in terms of my own spiritual journey, my own understanding of being able to
Mm.
sit in space and understand and feel folks who've passed. My father's really the first one that I felt that with. So
Wow. So, I mean, and condolences to your loss of your father, but it sounds like that's been a transformational moment in your life, right? Just being as young as you are, but in also your journey of understanding yourself. So, I mean, I think, you did say, right, the name of the podcast is Pain to Power. And
yeah.
you're talking about the pain, but so how would you really describe this idea of when we juxtapose pain and power and coming into that power from the pain? What does that mean for you?
Yeah, it took, when it happened, I think from like age 10 till about 17, 18. Um, it was a conceal, don't feel, don't let it show. Ha! Right? Lyric
Mm.
from Frozen. So, um, I had to learn to confront and embrace the pain and feel it. Right. And so my first girlfriend, who I met We started dating right after junior year of high school, allowed me the space to talk about that pain. That, and then also I was a part of this program. I was in high school in New York City, so it was part of the Spark program. And so it was my very first foray in terms of like going to some kind of therapy and counseling to talk about,
Mm.
right? And so having the space to talk about all of those feelings, I just buried it. And I think, when I zoom out, I think one of the things, this is not specific to just Filipino Americans or Asian Americans. I think in many communities of color, when you feel this kind of pain, we are taught not to find formal therapeutic outlets for it, right? Just
Yeah,
moving, keep living. Don't think about it.
keep
Don't talk
going.
about it, right? And so, the transformation into power became just the beginning of talking about my feelings. Be able to
Mm.
have a professional, a loved one, then several loved ones, like just being able to process it. And I think what I found over time is like people deal with those things. Like I'm not the only person that's lived on this planet that's had a parent pass at a younger age.
Mm.
So you find people,
Yeah,
you know how people
yeah.
deal, and you know how people deal were older than me, right? And I think one of the things that the transformation into power ultimately became my spiritual understanding that my father never left. So what I mean by that, he was not in physical form, but spiritually speaking, and this is my own spiritual outlook on life, is that when someone passes, they don't leave. They're just not of human form. And if I bring my mom into this space, my mom had the gift to be able to hear from folks who passed. I've
Oh,
inherited that gift. So,
wow.
it's- there were times I used to think I was a little crazy. I was like, wait, am I really hearing my dad? No, I am hearing my dad. Like real talk, right? I am literally feeling, sensing my father at all times. Because I think that really helped me. There's just my father never left. Because for me, it would have been harder to reconcile. Wait, I no longer am experiencing my father.
Mm.
Not saying I
Which,
never would have gotten over it, but that's really hard. I
but,
think.
and that's often how grief is framed, though, right? I think what you're doing is you're flipping that connection to people who have passed, in that there's this eternal existence still, right? And then if you have that, it sounds like that was your strength, right? Because then you never do have to say goodbye. You still have him with you, which is really powerful. And um, I love the simplicity of what you just said, though, is that the power is just talking about your feelings. And yet it sounds like it wasn't so simple. So tell me a little bit about, just in terms of even like that ability to finally express your feelings. How did that play out for you in you finding your own voice and strength, but also in challenges that comes up with that for you?
Yeah, I'd have to bring, the fact that a lot of my understanding and embracing of vulnerability came from being surrounded by women most of my life. Um, my mom, my two sisters, female friends, women I've gotten to know over time, right? I don't want to say that men cannot embrace their feelings. When you zoom out, societally speaking, men, cis hetero men, particularly, which I'm a cis hetero male, um, I've gotten pretty clear messages that you got to be tough. Don't
Mm-hmm.
talk about you. Men don't cry. Real men don't cry. I mean, if I told you all the times I cry over things, I cry thinking of like love ballads, literally. Like, I think I always had it in me, but it's really easy when you are taught a way to bury those things that men don't act like that, that cry. Like, if I go back to that moment that my father passed, when he passed, I wailed. I didn't cry after that for years. It was almost like I just shut it, put the straight
Mm-hmm.
jacket over like crying. And it
Yeah.
was funny. I think when I started to embrace crime more, it became cathartic. It was almost like I was, you know, using else from frozen, I was starting to come into understanding my power, which was really my vulnerability. So this leveraging pain into power became understanding that my vulnerability has always been one of my greatest strengths. And it took, I think, going through understanding the pain of my father's death, how my siblings and my mom dealt with it, and then having those outlets to be able to understand, wait a second, my reconciliation of it and understanding that has allowed me in other circumstances. My mom passed like 7 years ago. I've had other pain in my life, obviously. And so I think, at some level, you can't, in the range of emotions that we feel, um, you can't experience joy without pain. There's not a world where you just experience joy. Hopefully, there's not just a world where you just experience pain. But
And do we appreciate the joy, right? Like, I think that's it. Pain makes you appreciate and value the joy when you have the joy.
yeah, because there's an amount of relativity. Like, if you don't understand what pain is, you can't then understand what joy is, right? Because it's just a scale of understanding emotions, some level.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it was a gift for me at a young age to start to reconcile that pain. Like, that was like my Ron Rapatalo foundational pain was the passing of my father.
But it sounds like, Ron, through that, you have broken some barriers, some cultural barriers, but also just even the barriers, like you said, like of those messages to men and to boys, right? To not express those feelings and the power in it. And I think, again, beautifully, you said it, right? Vulnerability is your greatest strength versus a weakness, which is something that we're constantly talking about in this show. And I think I really appreciate always when we have men come on and speak to it, because there's so many men who don't recognize and understand that as the strength. And it can create a lot of pain that doesn't get healed.
Yeah.
So as you're thinking about this, like, and you mentioned that, like, this experience helped you to deal with other points in your life. How has what you learned through your father's passing, through this experience of starting to get to this place of recognizing the power that you can gain from the vulnerability as you process this pain, how's that helped you in other moments that you've had real big challenges in life?
Yeah. One of the ones that come to mind is dealing with like romantic breakups and romantic heartache, right? Which is its own kind of pain,
Yeah, it is.
right?
Yeah,
Um,
it is.
and I don't want to say that just because I had dealt with the passing of my father, all of a sudden with romantic breakups and that heartache, that I dealt with those things well, because I didn't always, right? It sucked. And it was a
Right.
different kind of pain. And my thinking wasn't always straight. And, I don't want to say it wasn't always my best self, but like, I don't know if I always did the best things for myself. But I ultimately knew that when I would talk about those things with loved ones, people I can let my hair down with, I've been with therapy on and off, forever. It's just something that's just necessary to be able to have someone to let down your guard with and be able to like process your emotions and come up with tangible strategies and tactics to be able to keep moving forward. Right. But romantic heartache comes to mind. There are things also in the workplace, frankly, right? So for, you know, a lot of my professional life, I've coached people. And I think coaching always came naturally to me because I take Philippine cultural values of generosity and wanting to be extremely helpful to people. I always wanted to be helpful to people at the workplace, friends, and I just became someone that my friends and colleagues sought for advice on a lot of different things, right? And so dealing with that pain allowed me to be compassionate. I think if you have not dealt with pain, it's hard to have compassion. Um, and for me, like, the understanding the word, like between empathy and compassion, I think I forget, it might have been um an Adam Grant posting that I saw recently about just the difference between empathy and compassion, right? Because with empathy, you could step in and really feel what someone's feeling, and you can get sucked into that. Compassion allows you to have a little bit of distance so that you're not sucked into feeling what someone is feeling all the way, but be able to like sit and be there for them, right? And for me, there's a from where I sit, right? I feel all the feels. It's a gift and a curse. I can really get
Mm-hmm.
sucked in if someone is dealing with something. I often tell people that I feel the range of all emotions. And
You know,
so,
no, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't
no,
cut
no,
you off.
no,
I was
okay.
like,
It's one of those things where I think I've had to learn to, because what happens is if I feel that flooding of feeling the emotions, I can't then be fully present for someone. Like I still want to feel, but I think if I get too sucked into those emotions, I don't think as clearly because I feel it. I think one of the
mm-hmm.
things about learning to be vulnerable is just having, if I use it as like thinking about frequency of light and the ranges of colors of light. That's how I feel emotions. I just feel the range, right? But as long as I don't get so into the range of the feeling of the emotions that it clouds my ability when I'm coaching someone to be helpful and sometimes be an ear. Because what can happen in my experience is that when you get into the feeling of the emotions, right, especially if it's something that's similarly happened to you, you then can get into a loop of maybe sometimes feeling what someone's feeling so much without helping them move forward. And that's
Mm.
not always helpful.
Right. So it's not healthy to have that. Well, I love how you just frame that in terms of empathy and compassion because it very much is how coaching has to happen though, right?
Yeah.
Because to be able to coach others, you have to have that full cup and the capacity to actually give, but not take on too much. I mean, I'm resonating with it right away because I would often be the person that many people have come to, right? And it can be overwhelming and it can be there's this balance, right? Even as you coach others of also taking care of yourself too, right? Because you have
Yeah.
to be ready to support others. But so in this and specifically thinking of you as a coach, right? And at the
Yeah.
moment when you started to see yourself now as a coach,
Hmm.
what are some of the things that you recognize were so important that stood out of the way that you approach coaching with others in terms of like just conditions that you think need to be present to build that relationship that really moves to movement for others when you're coaching?
Yeah. I think one of the fundamental values I think about with coaching is just believing people, but also verifying things and asking questions if things aren't clear. Um, I think that's particularly important for me because I center in my coaching relationships supporting people of color. Doesn't
Mm.
mean that I don't coach white people. They find me pretty easily. But I do center in terms of like where I want to be spending my time coaching people of color. Um, and one of the things I found is that our stories aren't often believed. And so sometimes in coaching, it's very easy to say, how could that be possible? You start asking all these questions, which could really throw somebody off. Right. And so one of the things I've learned is to, to believe, trust but verify, I think is a phrase I often hear. Right.
Mm.
Um, so I think that's really important. I think the second one, and this is where, you know, my understanding of like leveraging pain into power has come from my daily meditation practice. So sitting with myself, understanding of how I'm regulating and feeling emotions. When I am doing my best coaching, it's almost like two or three things are happening at the same time. I'm experiencing and hearing, I'm processing, and I'm feeling. And then all those things coexist at once, but I'm not letting any one of those things overwhelm the other, um,
Mm.
which is really hard to do. It's not to say I do that perfectly, but it's a lot to be able to like hear what's being said, process it, assess it, see what I'm going to ask next, and then also be able to like feel those emotions because I think the compassion and being able to seek to understand and be curious for me is one of the most important parts of coaching.
Mm.
I think
And I
having gone through the levels of emotions and pain, I think it just when I hear things from folks, I think at times folks want a coach to be able to like say, I hear you. I feel that. Even if I might not have exactly experienced that in the same way that that person has. I mean, if you were to be a fly on the wall with the many conversations I've had with people, I think I've had this uncanny ability for people to tell me things they sometimes don't tell other people very readily, if at all. I've had people tell me of like people passing, of things happening. It just, and I think that presence comes from like a lot of self work. Because if you
And
don't do that kind of work to be able to censor yourself and be present and almost be this vessel of being able to take an experience and then be able to, this is going to sound very foo-foo. I'm going to say, this is the way I think about it. I was talking with a dear friend of mine about this 2 years ago. She's a fellow kind of empath and like psychic about these things, like taking emotions and not just letting it take in. It's I take in them and I swirl it. So when I swirl it, then it allows me to kind of contextualize it without being like, oh my God, I'm like taking it all. It's like, no, I let it swirl. So I'm understanding, and just then something else can come out of it. But if I take it all in as is, it can be very overwhelming.
that's interesting. I like that idea of swirling. It's almost like processing from a distance, but still allowing yourself to look at all the angles of it.
Yeah.
Which is really great. And I think, and I know that we have a lot of people in the chat, and I just want to honor some of the comments we've had because people are getting very excited about some of the things they're saying. If we can throw also Last Man of Men, welcome. He said, it's sad that so many men, including myself, feel they cannot express pain and have to bottle it. And yes, and we definitely heard about that in some conversations with Greg last week at the last session. Sometimes you need a good cry. Exactly, Logic. And that's true, right? And I think that the vulnerability and the honesty of saying that you do is okay too, right? And Jose, welcome, Jose. He says, being Filipino, I can truly relate. Yes, and I know there are a lot of things that you did mention in terms of your own upbringing. So from this, though, in your coaching and in your experiences, you then you authored your book, Leverage.
Yes.
I mean, how did that,
crazy.
so that starts to talk about the connection between your own learnings in terms of your community, right? So I'd love to learn, and I want you to share with everyone your book and a little bit of what inspired that creation for you.
Yeah. So it's funny, right? I'm a procrastinator. And I thought about writing a book probably for a decade. And so I went through a book writing workshop, but didn't complete it. Probably been hit up a couple of times via LinkedIn. Hey, you should write a book. And I was like, I don't want to. And then in fall of 2022, someone hit me up and the timing just felt right. And I literally said, you know what? I'm going to throw my feet fully in the water, my body fully in the water, and come up with the book. Now, mind you, I didn't know exactly what I was going to write about. And so I was learning on the fly. Like, what does ghostwriting mean? Right. The way I describe it to folks now that I, partnering the same folks who helped me write my book is I literally talked my book into existence. I didn't write anything. It was all talking. And then they transcribed it. Here's a draft, edit it, published. Here's a book. That's oversimplifying, but that was really the process, right? Now, there was an early part of it, like ideating on what the book could be about in terms of the title, the table of contents, and then filling in the content. And so something that I just spent a lot of time thinking about is building, cultivating relationships with people. So if I rewind you all back to meeting my parents, if you can go back to 1980s, Queens, and seeing my dad be the life of the party, a magnet to people. And then my mom being different than my dad, but was the just no nonsense. My mom would see through bullshit and call you out on it. Sometimes not always the nicest way, right? But my mom just saw through bullshit and was very direct with people. And it's funny because when I think about the archetypes of people that I found in my own circle of champions, which is what I ended up writing my book about, is, from a career networking standpoint, who are the 7 people that have influenced me, and therefore the 7 archetypes of people that one needs in their career journey. That's what the book
Mm.
was about. And so I wanted to write a book that was around storytelling, lessons, and values, because I didn't want to write a book that was like all theoretical, because people remember theory. And I think the way that my
Mm.
mind works, I think a lot of people's minds work, is that when you share stories, it sticks. And so there was something really powerful when I was going through the process. It first started out with, who are these people in your circle of champions? Just talk about them. I was like, oh, my wife. It's like, oh, I'm teachers in grades in elementary and in high school. So actually one of the teachers, Mr. Saluga, was my fifth grade teacher when my father passed. And so I write about that in the empathetic teacher chapter in that instance. Um, but I wanted to write the book because I knew it was something that I had all these ideas. I was writing a lot on social media. I was doing, mini blogs, my Ronderings, right, which became
Mm-hmm.
my podcast. And I started using it as a 2018 New Year's resolution for me to post daily. I was like, let me write a Rondering. And so I'd always been writing at some level, coaching people, expressing thoughts around how do you build and cultivate relationships. And I think my social media connections are indicative of that, and so I'm just connected with a lot of people. And I enjoy connecting with people. And so, when I was talking with the folks who helped me write the book, Ken Gustafs in particular, was like, you seem really good at this. This is what you should write about, because it's something you're passionate about. And I kept saying the phrase that became the title of the book, because it's how I think about what career networking: leverage the people love and care about you personally, professionally. He said, that's
Mm.
the title, leverage. I said, no, leverage the people love and care about you personally. The phrase matters to me. It's long, and I didn't want the book to solely just be leverage, because that sounds like a physics book, right? Um,
Right, right.
so
But that word leverage is very powerful.
yeah,
Tell me, to you, when you think leveraging people, what that means for you, because I think it could be it's an individual interpretation sometimes, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, leverage for me is being able to ask people for like three things: advice, other connections, and opportunities, right? I mean, there's a little bit below, and I think about it from career networking, which is really what the book Leverage is about. It was really for those three things, right? And when I've coached people formally and informally in the job search and their entrepreneurial travails, et cetera, right? Um, if you don't leverage people, it is just that much harder to be able to find what's next, get access to what's next.
Mm.
And so for me, I think the important thing to say here is that, my idea of being able to leverage people comes from understanding that we don't do things on our own. The idea of like the singular person who does everything themselves, gets no help, the pull yourself up by the bootstraps bullshit we get taught about American history.
Hmm.
It's not true. It never was. Right. And
No.
what was important for me about the book was being able to relay for folks who look like you and I, Mario, for folks of the global majority, to say, what we live is a world of trust. And so that's what leveraging people ultimately is. You can't get access to advice, connections, opportunities unless you build trust. So one of my other like taglines is trust first, transaction second. And so at some level, what I'm writing in the book is sharing stories of how I've built trust with people.
Well, and I think what you just elevated is so important in terms of thinking about, um, you know, one, like you said, we need community, right? Like that's part of growth, and oftentimes that's not. Coaching is a very individual thing. So when you think about it as a community, and I love how you said that you need people to keep you to the next step, right? It is somewhat kind of what I was talking about in terms of at the very beginning, right? This idea that we have to look beyond, right, where we are, and we have to see where we've come from as well in the journey of growth. um, but I think when you say trust, that's so important. And particularly, you talk about how a lot of your coaching is focused on people of color. And I think trust is truthfully, trust and safety are the two things that are the most difficult things to create in environments when we talk about the impacts of systemic racism, when we talk about the impacts of patriarchy, like all of those things, right? So how is it though that and you talk about it as leverage the people who care about you. How do you frame that, this idea of who cares about you? Like, how do we know who really cares about us? What are those things that will stand out that you have learned through your process to
Yeah.
identify that?
Some of it is how you're feeling in the moment. I think, when we don't always need, I think, the language to understand how people make us feel. Now, being able to have better, decisive, clear language around a range of emotions is really important too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just following Brene Brown's work, right? So some of it is how people are making you feel. Like, if you're feeling cared about, I think it is something very human to understand what that can feel like, right? When someone is caring about you. So, but what's ultimately most important is like what actions are they taking, and then therefore what is motivating someone, and are they consistent with it for you to be cared about? Because for me, being cared about is some level someone who's consistent with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, Someone who's taking actions, right? Someone's caring about me, right? There's this idea of initiative, right? So someone is doing something like Mrs. and I, for example. It's just like, oh, we have this routine where it's like at night, pour a glass of wine for her and me. Cheers to the evening, right? And it just becomes, it's not asked for, it's just what I do.
Part of it.
This
Yeah.
report, and sometimes she does it before I get to it, but like I just do it. It's like a sign of like the show that I love her, right? And so a lot of times care comes from seeing also when someone is in need, being able to give them something that that can help them feel better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of that is really being attuned to listening in terms of like what could be helpful to them, right? If I think about the five love languages, right? They're all like not everybody's the same, right? So there's a certain level of attunement. If
Right.
someone's really showing that they're caring about you, they're not doing because like, oh, this makes me feel better, and like genuinely makes Mario feel better. So I'm going to do that for Mario, even if that wouldn't make me feel better, but that makes you feel better, and I'm consistent about that. I just show up, right? Um, but I think over time, like people tend to like, I think in our bodies and our souls, like we know those things, and because we're in bodies, having the ability to use language to describe those things and having that emotional vocabulary is incredibly important to learn. I'm no Brene Brown expert, but like when I saw and her HBO special of Atlas of the Heart, it's like, what are the three emotions people tend to have and describing everything? Happy, sad, mad, happy, sad, mad. If all we have is
Mm-hmm.
happy, sad, and mad, oh my God, we're in a world of trouble because there's a lot of gradations of emotions within that. Probably
There's so
another,
much.
and
Yeah.
when you don't have that ability to understand when someone is caring for you, if their intention is in the right place, you can often get tricked. And it's like, oh, I'm getting all these nice things. Is that really being cared for? Depends. Not always, right?
Right, right. Well, and I think so as so much of your work, and you talked about, right, it's really in career, right? How do you leverage this in your career path? How has that impacted, like that idea of caring and knowing and understanding it in your career is very different than the personal connections though. And like you said, I think that it can often be that people feel that companies care for them or that their bosses are caring for them, but in fact actually they are not being cared for, right? They are being manipulated, or they are being taken for granted, whatever those things may be, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is really important, and that's helpful to understand. So how did all of this then turn into, because you have your book itself and we talked about that, but also you have your podcast Ronderings, which it sounds like came from your blog of Ronderings. How did that now grow into a podcast, and what's your goal for your podcast?
Yeah. It's a great question. So, the origin of the podcast, you're right, came from me and a New Year's resolution 2018, wanting to share more of what I thought, right? Because it's musings, right? Wanderings,
Right.
ronderings, get
Yeah,
it?
yeah. I love the play on words.
Right. And, it's just become a part of my brand, right? The people associate, like when I started writing those ronderings, folks would message me and say, hey, what you write or this particular rondering really stuck with me. They would say why. Or sometimes I would just get on the phone with somebody and say, like, Ron, I love what you wrote, but they would never like or comment on anything. It was just like people read it, right? And so it was one of those
Yeah.
things that I think the platform of Ronderings started from me musing on things, career, life, belonging, sports, etc. Right? Wanted to create Ronderings, and so I was a guest on a lot of podcasts, right? And one of the things that often when I was a guest, I'd be told by hosts, have you thought about doing your own podcast? Because, I'm in New York, so I'm just saying, like, I'm dynamic. It's just, I know who I am.
Right, right.
I'm good at this, right? And 20 plus years of interviewing people for a living through my executive search and hiring world, I love asking people questions. It's just something I think that comes really naturally to me. And so I'm not going to talk about the Cat Williams, Shannon Sharp interview because I have my own feeling. That's not the
We're not going there
I have
today.
opinions
No.
about the quality of people interviewing, right? Just this. It's opinion, right? Because I think I take it. I don't want. I don't want to say other people don't take it seriously, but when I watch the output of some of these things, I'm just like, yeah, I don't know if that's the way I would flow these things or ask because and so I wanted to create a venue where I can bring the dope people that I've gotten to know
Mm-hmm.
and interview them. And what I didn't want to do was have it be so scripted where it's like watching like a scripted comedy. Those can be funny on TV, but my favorite comedies ever, the ones that are improv by nature. So if you
Mm-hmm.
ever watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, I think Curb Your Enthusiasm is brilliant. Now, let's be clear, is it easy to improv? No.
No.
Incredibly. From
Absolutely not.
an interviewing standpoint, it's one of my favorite things to do because what I tell my guests is the following. I say, I only have 2 scripted questions for you. What's your story at the beginning? So what's cool about the what's your story angle is people just talk and share their story. That gives me the body of things to ask, to be curious, but I could thread an entire episode just based on that, which I have. Now, to be clear, I do enough research to know things about people. Now, I've stacked the deck because oftentimes the people I have on my show disproportionately are people I've known from anywhere from like 5 to 30 years, right? So
Mm-hmm.
my wife was a podcast guest. I mean, if you want to call it easy, like we just started talking and then it was like, oh, this could have been a 10-hour episode. We just had a lot to talk. Like,
But I think that's the beauty of a good podcast is that it's just a great dialogue, right? It's just
yeah,
a great dialogue of getting to know two people or one person or whatever, right? Like to dig into the
yeah.
layers of just who they are, what their story is, right? Like you said. So what's the second question? So what's your story, and then
What's your rondering? What's the lesson or value you want to share with the audience? I had to hook it back to the title of the podcast, right?
what's your rondering? So like what would I be wondering? What is on my mind? That type of
Bingo.
thing. I
Yes.
love it. So
So,
how has that worked for you as a host in pushing your thinking in different places? Like what have you realized as you host this that in that format?
that you never know what people are going to share about their story. That people I think that I know, I don't know all their details. And like, oh my God, I didn't know that about you. And so because I'm coming into the podcast as a being super curious and wanting to amplify the brilliance and amazingness of my guest, I just get really excited when I find out things about them. Right. And so I also try to make sure I translate that excitement, one. But two, I think, you know, it just becomes a platform. I think what I wanted out of the podcast, and for me, the biggest learning is these are amazing people in my life, or getting to be in my life in some cases, that I want to give a platform to talk about their brilliance.
I love it.
And
I'm
with
all about it.
censoring people who look like us. Like that's really important to me. And so like
Mm.
I continue to look at my podcast guests and think through the different dimensions of identities and making sure I'm not missing anybody. I'm imperfect at that. I have some inklings of what I'm maybe missing a little bit of, but I try to make sure that I build something that is intentionally diverse because that mirrors the life that Shanita and my girls live. Like I often joke around with folks that I see my life as United Colors of Benetton at. There's always a horn at that age, like United Colors of what? I'm like, oh, see, you just have to look it up on YouTube after this or on your phone.
That's a generational thing,
Yeah.
but yes.
So.
But I love that because I think, and Logic and Friend says sold. Yeah, definitely, right? Sold. Like I think that's a brilliant, setup in where you're doing it. But what you're doing though, as it sounds like, is you're really leveraging storytelling. And the key of I think of it, and it's I think our paths are somewhat parallel in certain aspects as I'm listening to it, right? Like as we're thinking about it, right? Like my writing turned into my podcast, right? And my journey, I started with my journey, but now it's really about others' journeys, right? Like, and I think that same idea, but for me, it was really starting to dismantle the narratives that we have of others, right? It's this counter storytelling. And you're creating this platform then for others to be able to share their stories and authenticity, to open up in these ways, but also then to engage you in your thinking, right? And creating that community, which is beautiful. How do you think, and do you see an alignment between that and healing?
Yeah, the healing for me is like when you hear about other people's stories, there's always something that you can learn from someone else's story. So, how we got connected, Maria, the brilliant Keenan Bishop, right? And so Keenan's title of the podcast, which came from his Rondering, is like everybody samples, but just acknowledge your sources, right? And so this idea of creativity, like you're always borrowing a little bit from something else. Now, don't be lazy and go take the Busta like beat and just go rhyme over it. Yeah, I said it. Please be a little bit more inventive with the sampling. Gen Z, particularly. I know. Yeah, I'm calling it because it annoys me greatly. But I'm speaking as a 48-year-old who has particular wants of how music sounds. But anyway, I do think that the path for healing is when you hear those other stories and how people live and how you can take the way that they have lived their values. There are things that I take from what Keenan said and said, oh, wait a second, this idea of creativity is one where, look, if you just make sure you're paying honor to the people that you are learning from, that you're sampling from, then we can continue moving it forward. Because at some level, this idea of creating something from nothing doesn't really exist. Because if you take, the brilliant movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, everything that's existed already existed.
Nothing is in a vacuum, right? Nothing is in a vacuum.
So that for me, like the healing becomes really powerful from being able to like learn what people have gone through and what lessons and values they're sharing about what they've learned. And I think going back to something you said earlier, Mario, I think what I've realized in terms of the guests that I'm bringing, at some level, I am doubling down on the kind of people and universe of people I want in my life. Coaches, social justice advocates, leaders of color, people who care deeply about racial equity, right? I think that matters to me. I'm going to be picky about who I choose as a guest. And I think from the jump, when I think about my first 8 or 10 episodes, I'm like, yeah, I'm being pretty clear on the archetype of person I want on my podcast. And it's funny because for a living, I'm always talking to people, right? Recruiter, business development, being on social media. And so having conversations with a lot of people, it becomes a feel. I had someone that was coaching. And it was just a good vibe. I said, you should be on my podcast. I interviewed him at the end of the new year. So he's going to pop up on my podcast in like a couple of months. And so,
I love it. And I'm laughing because, Ron, I get it. Like, I think
yeah,
that's my life. Like, I walk around the world and I'm like, who do I meet that I can bring on this podcast to share a story?
you
I
never
mean,
know how
literally,
you're going
I
to meet
think
them, right?
almost all the guests I've had are people I've met, right? And
Yeah,
you just get a feel of, and again, the power of storytelling and everybody's stories. And some just need to be heard a little bit more, I think, for
yeah,
others to learn from, is what it is. Everybody has a story, but some are really important to elevate for what you can learn and gain from them, which I love, in terms of how you've really put together. And it's about community, right? Like, you're going back to this idea of community and connection and those core values. So
yeah,
as you've done all this, right? Like, we started and opened up about your childhood, but in
yeah,
your adulthood now, I mean, you're a father of two daughters, you're a husband, you're so much more, and so many things in the professional space and creative space. But what are the things that you still yourself have to kind of like navigate to understand and be able to continue on this path without not missteps? I think we always have missteps, right? But that
yeah.
just give it more ease. Not, it's never going to be perfect, right? But it allows you to have more ease. It allows you to move forward. Like, what are those things for you?
Yeah. One of my previous podcast guests, Kate Gerson, who you know,
Yeah.
um, when she was talking with me, one of the things we talked about, not on the podcast, but in a conversation after, it was like doing your shadow work. And so she asked me to get, Pema Chodron's book, right? Very popular one, whose title I'm forgetting, but it's somewhere in one of my bookcases. Um, so this idea of like, what are the shadows that are still around me that I need to continue to reconcile now that I'm age 48? And I think it built a level of like deeper awareness and a circle of people that are willing to hold the mirror up for me. Some of
Mm,
those people have been articulately named in my circle of champions. There are many other people not in that book that hold up the mirror to me, because some of it I just seek that out, right?
mm, mm-hmm,
And so some of the shadow work that I continue to deal with is like this line of confidence and cockiness.
mm-hmm,
And so I'm I'm very confident about a lot of things, and I know because of how I can bring myself and talk, it can be cocky. I've had a number of people throughout my life say, "You are a cocky mother." I'm like, "I'm from motherfucking New York. That's damn right. I'm fucking I'm like, Ron. Hold on, chill. Bring Brook. Let's see. That was Brooklyn Ron. So I have this uh alter ego that I call Brooklyn Ron.
mm-hmm,
So Brooklyn Ron is he's tough. He's the if something needs to get done, because like this Ron that you're all speaking to doesn't want to
mm-hmm,
have it happen or scared to. If I bring Brooklyn Ron, is just, he's a bulldozer, and he's gonna let you
mm.
know what's gonna happen, and you're not gonna be able to stop it. That's Brooklyn Ron.
So is Brooklyn Ron the cocky though, a little bit then, or
Oh
is Brooklyn
yeah,
Ron? Yes.
100%.
Okay. So
Cocky
so have you
bulldozer in
have you
your
made
face.
missteps through Brooklyn Ron being present in places that it should have been more confidence than cocky?
Oh, absolutely. Or more like humble, just chill, Ron. It's okay. Take it all in, right? I think Brooklyn Ron got me to be more confident in spaces where I wasn't always confident. Like when I was
Mm, mm-hmm,
at work, right? When I would be around people that were older than me and had more experience and master's degrees and doctorates. I'm like, oh, just fake it. Be a lot more confident, right? And I think, the question I asked myself, this is a little bit of combination of like Tony Robbins and stuff I've learned in adaptive leadership, is, you know, the values and things that got you to where you are today and actions, is that something that you need to move forward?
mm,
I think I'm always going to need a little bit of Brooklyn Ron, because I'll give an example. Like Brooklyn Ron comes in handy when I do powerlifting, because it's a very intense kind of like oomph kind of like workout, right? If I'm calm, that doesn't always work.
mm-hmm,
Brooklyn Ron comes in really handy. So if you ever watch me work out like that, that Ron is a very different Ron. But it's a part of me. It's who it's. I'm not saying that's not who I am.
Right, right.
But I think in workplaces at times, that cocky part of Brooklyn Ron is not who I need to be able to continue moving forward. In fact, he's not really needed in most work situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Another one is figuring out how do I avoid less and get more. This is where like Brooklyn Ron like overcorrects for my avoidance tendency.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, if I get like, why does Ron Rapatalo avoid? This goes back to like how I dealt with the death of my father, amongst other things going on in my family. Right? There's just a lot of big family. There were fights. There just was, right? And so um, avoidance became a mechanism as the youngest child of being able to not know how to deal with all the stuff happening and kind of blocking it out.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've learned or continue to learn around avoidance is when I avoid things, this is where procrastinating, it's just like that feeling of like, I don't want to do those things that moment, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
not everything's always going to feel good. He's just figuring out what the inertia is, the environment that it takes for me to do work and to get things done. So I don't just let things sit and do stuff last minute. And so now I've not been clinically diagnosed with this yet, but I have a burning suspicion I'm somewhere on the spectrum of ADHD. This should not surprise you or anybody else that's like ever gotten to know me, right? It's like, yeah, that tracks, right?
Okay, great. Okay, yes.
Be a little inattentive.
I think a lot of adults are undiagnosed with ADHD. Right. That's the truth.
Yeah. And so I know that, there are things around what I need to do to get better that I think I've known for some time, but my next journey is to be able to understand how to not let those things get so in the way of me feeling more pain to get work done or get things done, right? Because there's anxiety and things that I feel like, oh, I gotta get these things done. Like, wait a second, Ron, why do you have to just chip away? It's like what people do when they project plan, right? You chip away, you get pieces of the work. Don't get it done all at once. Just chip away at it. Like, oh yeah, that's right. That makes sense. It's what I coach people to do. In fact, it's like, but I don't always do it myself,
right? You don't always follow the same advice sometimes, but no, that's and I appreciate like what you said, even in terms of like the balance of some of these things, like particularly when you were talking about the confidence and cockiness. And I'm just thinking in terms of, again, you mainly coach and a lot of your writing and everything is really centered around social justice. And a lot of it is about people of color. And I think those are two things that are often very complex and need to be very intentionally created to remind others to do, because in a lot of the internalized beliefs that people have of themselves from society's messages when we're talking about people of color, right, is that confidence is either their arrogance, right, or it can be that they don't have that confidence because it's been cut down. So I think you have to have it present. You have to be present with that that little bit of cockiness to push through, but then that really getting to the confidence itself. So I appreciate the balance and how you explain that, right? And Last Man of Men says, got to control the ego. Ego is a beast. That's for certain. Absolute certain. But it has a presence. And I think that's the key, is that it always has a presence, right? We're complex people. And we are a dynamic means that you're holding the complexities of those different things, right? And I really appreciate that. And I'm so appreciative of your time today, Ron. As we're closing out, though, I would love to know, are there other projects specifically? Where should people go to follow you in terms of your coaching? You have a lot of great resources, and I know your company itself is Leverage Publishing. We didn't even talk about that, but you're ghostwriting. So anybody who's interested in that as well, just share with us what should we be looking for from Ron?
Yeah. So I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. That's where I usually have people find me. I'm the only Ron Rapatalo on LinkedIn, so not hard to find. Follow me, connect with me. I don't say no to a connection unless you're trying to sell me something off the get. Um, so find me there. Leverage Publishing Group. So the folks that helped me write the book Leverage, I partner with them to do a book publishing company to ghostwrite, edit, and publish first-time authors. So
I love that.
it was really important to me because I did this stuff in a vacuum, right? At first, I didn't know what it was like to get a book out there. So I learned so much that I want to be able to disrupt the sector to be able to get folks, particularly who look like us,
Mm-hmm.
right, to have access to be able to get a book. Because the thing I found out about writing a book is that it's given me the credibility of a doctorate and MBA, but at a tenth of the cost. We have so
Mm.
much that we've lived work-wise, life-wise, that we have a lot to be able to talk about. Now, it doesn't mean that all of us that are going to write a book need to be writers. In fact, I don't. I post about this in one of my Ronderings online. I said, I am not a writer, but I am a storyteller. I've always been a storyteller. Nothing wrong.
Mm.
That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I have people help support me for the writing, right? I'm just
Right.
better at the structure and things like that. But this, if you were to say, so when you asked me originally, Mario, about what I wanted to do with the podcast, boy, you know the big dream is someone sponsors it and pays me to do it for a living.
That's like my dream. I hear you.
You know, well, I think what I've heard, like a buddy of mine that I'm actually interviewing for a podcast, he's in the podcasting world, right? And, I hear this over and over again. It's about consistency. You just got to have a number out there. It doesn't mean you get to 50, 100, all of a sudden pops off, right? But the consistency of having episodes, a lot of people drop off after like the first 10 or 15, from what I've heard.
Mm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to have my 30th episode drop this Wednesday.
Congratulations. That's awesome. That's
It's
very
cool.
cool.
And it does not feel like work. It doesn't. Like, if I tell you my formula for it, it's like I show up on the mic, people talk. I have folks who produce everything behind the scenes. I get materials from my guests, and then I just keep it moving. Right. It doesn't mean that the next iteration of me doing it won't look different. I don't know. Maybe it will. Right. But
Right.
it's really that straightforward. It's just like all the great conversations I have with people. I tell folks, I just want it to be recorded. That's the podcast.
And that's beautiful. I love that because I think honestly, again, like I think there's so much alignment in our visions of how this all needs to come out. And yes, and I'm hoping for the exact same thing. If I could do this and be monetized with it, this would be what
Yes.
I did, right? Like this will be one day, right? I'm putting it out in the world. But thank you so much. Definitely make sure you go and check out all of those different resources that Ron is offering. Go check out his brilliance, check out the book for sure. Go to LinkedIn and follow him. Please make sure you are also following me if you have not done so yet. Go and subscribe to this channel, hit the bell so you get all the notifications. Will have more dynamic guests. Thank you to my producer and director, Mr. M. Montaigne, Logic, the man behind the scenes, always making everything happen. Thank you to our Ranters Network for all of their support, for everyone who shows up and pulls up to the show and supports. And please make sure, so if you are, I happen to be, I'm going to do a little plug here too, and I don't know, Ron, if you have any South Asian friends, but I am going to be speaking and sharing in one of our sessions for South Asians in Solidarity, which is it's affinity group for all South Asians talking about anti-racism. And on January 28th, there is an invite that'll go out on Eventbrite where I will be leading the session and conversation on talking about our socialization and the impact that has on the messages that we have internalized, but also that we then project to others. So please make sure you go and sign up. Make sure you go to my blog also. I am Brown Girl Interrupting, and I am a writer. And thank you again, Ron. Thank you to everyone who showed up today. Have an amazing evening. And please make sure that you always join us on Sundays at 9 o'clock on Pain to Power. And as you are continuing in your healing journey, keep looking and visioning for all those people in your community you can leverage and shepherd into the spaces that you are trying to move into while reflecting on the spaces you have come from. So thank you so much. Peace, love, and light.
Peace.
Hi, my name is Maria. but you are soon going to know me as Brown Girl Interrupting. And what I mean by that is that very soon, hopefully, you're going to be following my blog. I am a writer, and I started writing because I was married, I had children, and then my life changed when I separated, and I did a lot of learning and reflecting and growing in that process of change, because change always leads us to that. And I've decided to share that with the rest of the world, because sometimes hearing that someone else is going through the same thing as you, or understanding and putting words to the feelings and experiences we're having, helps us to heal from them, or grow from them, or learn from them. And so that's what my blog is. It's writing about life, healing, relationships, parenting, dating, marriage, pain, love, mistakes, growth, and coming out whole still. My world has slowly crumbled around me countless times, and every time I rebuild with the pieces I've been given to birth something so transformational and beautiful that no one else knew might exist before it was shown to them. These moments tend to coincide within my romantic path. The universe has been telling me to focus on the revolution and not romance. It has over time given me the tools, resilience, and light to turn my pain into power. And only now do I see that the key to this always resided in the love and knowing I had in myself, not from the external sources of family or men. The message I have been avoiding might be that my time in this world I had existed in was not to receive love, but to put it out there for others to see, feel, and heal through. Revolution before romance moves pain into power.